The gunshot meant for her killed her sister instead. A Lakota chief gave her a reason to live. The first time I saw her, she was standing in the river. Not bathing, not crossing, just standing, up to her knees in the Powder River in the last of October, her dress soaked to the thigh, her arms loose at her sides like she'd forgotten they were there. The morning was cold enough that her breath made small clouds above the water. She wasn't moving. Hadn't moved in the time it took me to ride down from the ridge, dismount, tie my horse to the cottonwood. I'd seen men stand like that before, after the Fetterman fight, after Sand Creek. A man gets a certain stillness to him when the part that decides things has gone quiet. I walked to the bank and stood there, didn't call out. You don't call out to a person standing like that. You wait. You let them feel you there without startling them, the way you'd handle a horse that's been run too hard and doesn't know yet it's safe to stop. She turned her head slowly, looked at me across maybe 12 feet of water. She was white, young, not a girl but not settled into herself either, late 20s maybe. Her hair was dark and coming loose from where she'd pinned it. Her face had been pretty once. You could still see the shape of it, but her eyes had the gone-in look, the look I recognized. I said in English, "Come out of the water." She looked at me for a long time. Then she looked back downstream, at something I couldn't see or maybe something that wasn't there at all. Then she turned and waded out. She sat down on the bank without being asked, and I crouched a few feet away. And we stayed like that for a while with the river moving between us, and the cottonwood leaves coming down yellow one at a time. That was the beginning of it, though I didn't know then that it was a beginning at all. My name is Lakota Swiftwind. I was 43 years old that autumn, chief of a band of Oglala Lakota numbering, by then, fewer than 200 souls. We had been given land in the Powder River country under a treaty that the government had already begun to forget. We had our horses and our lodges and a winter coming that I knew would be hard, and I had been riding circuit of the eastern boundary, a thing I did alone, something that gave me the space my head required, when I came down from that ridge and found her in the river. I had been a chief for 11 years, my father before me, his father before him. I had led men into fights I believed were just and some that weren't, and I'd carried that. I had a wife once, Chaska. She died of the coughing sickness 8 years back, and our son with her, and I hadn't talked about that to anyone. You don't. You carry it and you keep moving because the people are there and they need you to keep moving. But I'll tell you something I've never told anyone. There were mornings that autumn when I'd ride out to the eastern boundary and I wouldn't be sure, heading back, whether I'd turn the horse toward camp because I wanted to or because I simply didn't know what else to do. Not the same as that woman in the river, but not entirely different either. The difference between a man who has decided and a man who is just very tired, sometimes that gap is narrower than anyone on the outside can see. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand what she walked into when she walked into my life. She thought I was the solid one, the rock, and I was, mostly. A chief has to be. But there are things you carry that you set down when you finally find someone safe enough to set them down with. I didn't know yet that she was going to be that person for me. Her name was Nora Halstead. I got it out of her in pieces over the next few days. She had a camp about a mile upriver. Just a camp, a horse, a bedroll, a tin pot, a rifle she didn't know how to use, and a canvas pack with 3 days of food left in it. I brought her back to it after the river. She didn't want to come to our village. I didn't push. You don't push. You just stay close enough that a person knows they're not alone and you wait. The first night I built her fire higher and sat across it, and she told me, in fragments, what had happened. She'd been traveling with her sister, Clara, younger by 2 years. They'd been heading west from Missouri, their father dead, their farm sold, some cousin in Oregon they'd maybe been going to find. I gathered the exact destination had been more hope than plan. They were 2 women alone on the trail, which was already a harder thing than it should have been, and somewhere east of the Bighorns they'd been set on by 3 men who wanted the horse and the supplies and weren't particular about what else they took. There'd been a shot, meant for Nora. Clara had stepped in front of it. Nora said that part once, flat and quick, and then she stopped talking and looked at the fire, and I didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say. I'd lost enough people to know that when someone tells you a thing like that, the worst thing you can do is fill the silence with words. Clara had lived 3 days. Nora had buried her by a creek she didn't know the name of, somewhere she probably couldn't find again, and then she just kept moving. She'd been moving for 2 weeks before I found her in the river. She said at the end of that first night, "I keep thinking, if I'd been 6 inches to the left." I said yes. She looked up at me, surprised maybe that I hadn't argued with her. I said, "You will think that for a long time, maybe always, but you living doesn't make her more dead. You being dead wouldn't make her more alive." She looked at me for a long moment, then she looked back at the fire. But she stayed. She didn't go back to the river. I came back the next morning with food from camp. Dried meat, some corn Winona had put up. I didn't make a thing of it, just set it down, built the fire up, started water for coffee. She had coffee in her pack, and I'd noticed the night before that she'd rationed herself to half a cup, trying to make it last. She watched me work for a while, and then she said, "You don't have to do this." I said, "I know. I'm not your problem." I said, "I didn't say you were." She was quiet a moment. "What do you want then?" It was a fair question. I thought about it honestly. I said, "When I found you in the river yesterday, you were deciding something. I'd rather you decided different." She looked down at her hands. "You don't know me." "No," I said. "But I know that look." She went still. I said, "I've had it myself. Different circumstances, same look." She raised her eyes to mine. She had gray eyes, I noticed then for the first time. The kind of gray that looks dark in low light and almost silver in full sun. She said, "You're a chief." "Yes." "Chiefs don't," she stopped. "Don't what?" "Get lost," she said quietly. "That's what I was going to say, but that's a stupid thing to say." "It is," I said, "but you didn't know better." Something loosened in her face. Not a smile, not quite, but something. "I need to back up. I haven't explained who I was to my people yet, and I need to, because without that you won't understand what I was risking. Or rather, what I didn't care that I was risking in staying near this woman." There were men in the village, and I won't name them, who had strong feelings about white settlers in the Powder River country. They were not wrong to have those feelings. What had been done to us, taken from us, promised, and then broken, they were not wrong. Red Dog most of all. Red Dog had lost brothers. He spoke for a faction that wanted no contact, no allowance, nothing that looked like accommodation. He would watch me. Those mornings I rode out east. And sometimes when I came back, I'd feel his eyes on me in a way that said he noticed the direction I was keeping to. Bringing a white woman into camp, I didn't do that. I want to be clear. I never once suggested she come to camp. I visited her at her camp. That was different. That was my own time, my own ground, nobody's business. A chief has a private life, same as any man. But I'll tell you, I knew from the 3rd day or the 4th that I was going there for reasons that went beyond keeping her from going back into the river. I was going there because she was easy to talk to in a way that I hadn't found in years. Because she listened like she was actually hearing the words, not just waiting for a gap to fill. Because she asked questions that weren't intrusive or foolish. She'd ask about a thing I'd mentioned in passing, 2 days later, having actually remembered it and turned it over in the time between. And because, if I'm honest, she was doing something for me just by needing me to be steady. When you've spent years being the person everyone else leans on, there's a particular kind of rest in finding someone who needs the leaning. Not that she was helpless. She wasn't, not at all. She split her own firewood from day 3. She'd figured out the rifle by day 5. There were plenty of rabbits near camp, and she went after them with a serious look on her face that said she'd decided to be capable. She was. But she was still fragile in the specific place of her grief. And I knew how to sit with fragile things. I'd had to learn. About 3 weeks in, Red Dog rode out to the eastern boundary. He found me at Nora's camp. I had brought her a blanket, a proper trade blanket, not charity, because hers wasn't going to be enough once the cold came in hard. We were sitting by the fire eating rabbit she'd cooked herself. I heard the horse before Red Dog showed himself. I stood up before he came out of the trees. He looked at the camp, at her, at me. His face didn't move. He spoke in Lakota. I'll translate it as closely as I can. He said, "The men are watching you." I said, "I know." He said, "She is white." I said, "I can see that." He said, "Her people broke the treaty. Her people drove us from the Black Hills. Her people." I said, "Red Dog. She is not her people. She is one woman who lost her sister and nearly lost herself. I am not asking the village to take her in. I am not asking anything of anyone. I am asking you to ride back and tell the men that I see what I'm doing and I've considered it, and I stand behind it." He looked at me for a long time. Red Dog was not a man who backed down easily. He said at last, "You are lonely, Lakota." I said, "Maybe." He said, "Loneliness makes men do things they regret." I said, "So does holding on to anger past the point where it's any use." His jaw tightened. He turned his horse and rode. I sat back down. Nora was looking at me. She hadn't understood the words, but she'd understood the shape of it. She said, "That was about me." "Yes. He doesn't want you here. He wants me to be something I can't quite manage to be," I said. "At least not about this." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "You should go, Lakota, you really should. I'm not worth the trouble I'm costing you." I looked at her. The fire between us, the November dark coming on, the first real cold of the season beginning to sharpen the air. I said, "Let me be the one to decide what's worth what." She held my gaze a long time. Then she said, "All right." I brought her to the village in December. That's not the whole story of how it happened. There was a week of cold so hard that her camp became untenable, and a conversation in which I didn't precisely ask and she didn't precisely agree. But we arrived at the same conclusion from 2 different directions, and I rode back with her behind me on the horse when the temperature had gone down to where you could see ice crystals in the air at midday. Winona took her in without being asked. Winona was 50-some years old and had outlasted 2 husbands and had opinions about everything, but expressed them mainly through action. She put a robe around Nora's shoulders and handed her a bowl of soup, and that was that. Red Dog said nothing. A few of the younger men watched, some of the women too. Nora kept her head up and looked directly at people and said greetings in Lakota, which I'd been teaching her, just the most basic words, enough to show respect, and I watched people register that she'd made the effort. It helped not entirely, but it helped. She slept in Winona's lodge. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't thinking about her in that way yet, or rather I was, but I wasn't acting on it. A chief has to be careful about what signal he sends, and bringing a woman to camp and immediately taking her to his lodge would have been the wrong signal in too many directions. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't know. I knew, the way you know things you're not quite ready to say out loud. There was something between us that had been building since the river, some current, and by December it had weight to it. I could feel it when we talked. When she laughed, she'd started laughing again, just small things, but still, I felt it like a thing happening in my chest. I was 43 years old. I hadn't felt that in 8 years. I didn't entirely trust it. That's honest. When you've lost someone, when you've put the best of yourself into a grief and carried it long enough, it gets hard to believe the feeling is real and not just your loneliness inventing something to want. I kept waiting for it to go thin, for her to become ordinary. She didn't. In January, she came to my lodge. Not like that, in the middle of the afternoon with Winona's knowledge. She had something on her face that I recognized as having made a decision. She said in her careful, still-learning Lakota just the word for talk. I said yes, and we went inside and sat. She said in English, because her Lakota wasn't up to what she needed to say, "I want you to know something." I waited. She said, "I came to this country wanting to disappear. That's the truth. Clara died and I thought the only thing left was to wait for the waiting to be over. I couldn't even call it wanting to die. It was more like I'd just stopped being interested in going on." I said, "I know. I know you know," she said. "That's what I want to tell you. You knew. You saw it and you didn't look away and you didn't try to argue me out of it. You just stayed." She paused. "And I want to tell you that I'm not in the river anymore. I mean that. I got out of the river because you asked me to, and I stayed out of it because of you. And I'm not saying that to put something on you that you didn't ask for. I'm saying it because you deserve to hear it, because somebody should tell you what you did." I looked at her. She said, "You saved me. This quiet, steady, stubborn Lakota chief who showed up on a riverbank and didn't say a single foolish thing. You saved me." My throat was tight. I don't cry easy. I'm not built that way. But I felt the back of my eyes burn and I let it come for a moment before I got it back under control. I said, "You didn't make it easy." She laughed, a real one. Then she said, "Neither did you. Sitting there every morning like it was just something you did, like I wasn't a complete disaster." "You were not," I said. "A disaster, broken, yes, that's different." "Is it?" "Broken things can be mended," I said. "Disasters are just damage." She looked at me for a long moment with those gray eyes. The winter light coming through the smoke hole made everything soft. She said, "I think I love you." 3 words, plain as water. I sat with them, let them be real. I said, "I think I've known that for a while." "About me." "About both of us," I said. She reached across the space between us and took my hand. Just that. Her fingers around mine, her hands smaller than mine but strong, the knuckles chapped from winter work, real hands that had been doing real things. She held on. I let her. It was the first time, since Chaska, that I'd let someone hold on. "I'm going to tell you about Red Dog. Because you might think the story ends in that lodge in January, and in a sense the heart of it does, but Red Dog is part of the truth of it and I won't leave him out. He came to me in February alone, no audience. He stood outside my lodge and I came out to him. He said, 'She is staying.' It wasn't a question. I said yes. He looked out over the camp. The snow had come heavy and the lodges were mounded white and the horses stood thick-coated in the cold. He watched it all for a while. He said, 'My grandmother was taken by white men. Did you know that?' I said, 'I didn't know that.' He said, 'She was taken and she died in their captivity. I was very young.' I have carried that." He paused. "I am not saying that to justify myself to you. I am saying it so you understand why I said what I said." I said, "I know why you said it." "She is not what I said she was," he said finally. "The woman, she carries wood. She doesn't put herself above anyone. Winona says she learns the language seriously, not like most whites who learn enough to show off." A pause. "She is not what I expected." I said, "Most people aren't." He looked at me then, his face still hard but something different in the eyes. He said, "You are a better man when you are not alone." I didn't know what to say to that. He turned and walked back through the snow before I had to find something. Spring came the way it does out here, sudden and violent. A week of blizzard and then one day the light is different. The air smells different. The horses are restless. And then you blink and the grass is green. Nora and I were married in the Lakota way in late April, when the cottonwoods were just putting out their leaves. Winona supervised the whole thing and had opinions about everything, and the ceremony was simple. the way I wanted it. I remember her standing beside me in the morning light, her dark hair loose, a blanket around her shoulders that Winona had given her. She was looking at the land, the Powder River country spreading out to the east, brown and green and gold in the new spring, the sky enormous. The way she looked at it, you wouldn't have known she'd once been standing in that river deciding whether to stay. She took my hand, squeezed once quick like a signal. I squeezed back. It wasn't a grand thing. It was a private thing between two people who had come to it the hard way. We were not young. We had both been broken and found our way to something that held. That was enough. That was more than enough. I want to tell you one more thing. There's a morning I go back to when I need to. It's nothing special, which is maybe why it stays with me. It was early summer. I'd been up before dawn, I usually was, and I'd gone out to the horses, and when I came back Nora was awake and had the fire going. She had a tin cup in each hand and she held one out to me when I ducked through the lodge door. Coffee. Real coffee, which we'd traded for and which we drank slowly because we were careful with it. I took the cup. She was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite name, not intense, not dramatic, just attentive, the way you look at something you're glad is there. I said, "What?" She said, "Nothing, just you." I sat down. We drank our coffee. Outside, the camp was beginning to move, someone's child, somebody's dog, the low sound of women talking by the cook fires. She was still watching me, that quiet, particular way. I said, "Stop." She said, "No." And she smiled, kept looking, like she had all morning and intended to use it. I drank my coffee, and I let her look. A man who spent the better part of 20 years believing his worth had already been used up. Everything that was ever going to be seen in him already seen. Everything that was ever going to matter already passed. A man like that, when a woman with clear eyes and a steady heart sits across from him in the morning light and looks at him like he is still, after everything, worth looking at, I'll tell you what that is. That is the thing. That is the whole thing. The Powder River country, my people, a woman I didn't expect, a cup of coffee going warm in my hands. I have nothing to complain about, not one thing.